just asks the question, what if? What if is an amazing question, because we all come, as he says, with our different lenses through life. My lens, as he's introduced me, thank you, is the lens of somebody who's worked in the criminal law and other areas of law for now 30 years, but 20 in crime. And my particular lens of a creative solution to a big issue, which I understand is the theme of today, is the area of drugs. And Fortis says in one of his what ifs, what if we were to legalize drugs? When I started in criminal law 30 years ago, the one statistic we were given was 80% of all burglaries and muggings, in other words, acquisitive crimes, were committed in order for drug users to get drug money. 80 to 90%, and that was 30 years ago. When I stopped doing criminal law, about 20 years ago, the figure, if anything, had increased. I checked the statistics. In 1970, there were 9,000 criminal convictions relating to drugs, and the statistic then was that 15% of young people were themselves involved in drug taking. 25 years later, 94,000 drug-related offences and 45% of young people involved in taking drugs. I don't want to talk a lot about statistics, but I just want to deal with a few more, because this what if is firstly to identify the issue, to identify the problem. In 2011, there were 4,611 deaths related to the taking of drugs. In 2016, which are the latest figures available, nearly 50% of people between the ages of 15 to 16 were taking drugs. And just to put the whole thing in a global context, it's said that the illegal drug trade accounts for 8% of world trade, and to put that into figures, that's £300 billion a year. My contention then is that prohibition of drugs, in other words, making drugs illegal, hasn't worked. It doesn't work and it won't work. And what I want to discuss today are further issues about how we can tackle that and what, if it is, my creative solution would be. So the first point, the legalizing of drugs would take all of us to deal with a number of vested interests. And it's interesting that when I looked at the statistics of this, if you take an organisation like HSBC Bank a few years ago, they were fined $1.9 billion because they were concerned in the laundering of £810 million of drugs money. I remember a case I was involved in a few years back, and I won't digress in any great detail on it. But in this case, I was representing a man who was in prison for 25 years, and he had been convicted of importing heroin. And what he told me was that there had been, known to him, an arrangement between somebody in UK customs and somebody in the drugs world, whereby there would be an intervention to stop drugs coming in, and there would be hundreds of tons of heroin being caught. But as a kind of make-weight for that, a lot of drugs were allowed in, and the drugs that were intercepted were of a low-grade quality. And what that meant to him, and what that meant to many of us who look at this, is that this area of legalizing drugs is a particularly complicated one. The incentive for the drugs world is enormous. And I know, certainly through my eyes of representing people, that one of the ways that people are trapped is that if you get into drug debt, what happens is that those you owe money to will take over your accommodation if you're renting it and use it as a place to sell drugs from. And if you're a woman and you're caught in drug debt, it's often turned around into prostitution. So these are real pressing social issues. The problem that we have by having an illegal drugs trade is that the gangsters, as I would call them, have an absolute monopoly on the production and distribution of all drugs. And so when we think about what are in our drugs, if we ever take any time to think about it, those who've analysed it come up with some extraordinary facts. Washing powder, which we may think is there to wash our clothes is, in fact, often an ingredient in drugs, because what the drug traders are doing are trying to dilute the drugs they have with, if I may call it, rubbish ingredients, so that the quantity gets larger and the profits get bigger. And one of the other extraordinary things that those who look into it have found out as being an ingredient of drugs, there's this drug that is there to treat parasitic worms in livestock. That's one of the drugs that's used to make the drug amount larger by adding in impurities and additives. Another thing that's used is anesthetics. And so when I looked in advance of speaking today about the consequences of all this, in the BBC News just a few days ago in Cumbria, there was an article that 16 people had died since December of 2017 because of the taking of these kinds of drugs. And so I come back to the creative solution. You ask any politician who wants to get on will not say they want to legalize drugs. And they won't say it for a number of reasons, chiefly the press like the Daily Mail. Any, for example, potential Home Secretary who was to say, I'm interested in legalizing drugs, will have some kind of headline saying, new Home Secretary wants all children to take drugs, or something like that, and it makes them unelectable. If, however, you ask those close to the coalface, police officers, for example, I've had the advantage of speaking to 3 chief constables in the last couple of years about this identical issue, and each of them, and it may be that I just chose some who were unrepresentative, but each of the 3 said that if they had their way, drugs would be legalized. Now, I may have mentioned, one mustn't talk about oneself too much, but I gave up criminal law some time ago and I went into family law. One would have thought that these sorts of issues wouldn't travel, but only yesterday, a quite awful story representing a mother of a 6-week baby. When the baby was born, the baby had an addiction to heroin and had to be weaned off. And when we're looking, this is a care proceedings case where one determines where a child lives with, the mother was given the choice of trying to get off of drugs and trying to get her baby back, or recognizing that she couldn't. The amazing thing is, which just emphasizes how powerful the problems are, this woman felt that she could not. And so I wanted to share with you one final example. I know we're limited in time, but one final example of my experience and the desperation of it all. When I was prosecuting near to Gatwick Airport and Heathrow Airport, when you're instructed by the Attorney General, they give you a pile of papers and they say, get on and prosecute those. And you could virtually just change the names and keep the facts the same. And this is what it was. Citizen person from Jamaica, in these examples, being given £300 to £400 to swallow 50, 75 or 100 packages so that they could get on an airplane in Jamaica, fly into one of these airports and get some through. 10% of those people would unfortunately die because one of the packages would be burst and the drug would go into their system. 70% of the people would be caught, leaving 20% to get through, and that 20% was enough for the drug gangsters to make their money and then some. But it's the 70% who got caught that I was particularly dealing with, and I was prosecuting. And unfortunately, or fortunately, when it comes to these issues, there's a set criteria. So it'll say something like, if you import 500 grams, it'll be 12 to 15 years, 700 grams, 15 to 18 years, a kilo, and it's 20 plus. And so what you had on this day, for people having been paid £400 a time on average, were the dishing out of 10, 15, and 20-year sentences to these people who were absolutely clueless, I suspect, on the implications, but who left behind in their homes in Jamaica utter devastation, with children left behind, families left behind, etc., etc. So what is the solution? Well, the solution, in my view, it's easy to say, is this. I am firmly of the view, and it's a growing view shared by a number of people who unfortunately haven't yet persuaded the politicians, that each and every drug should be legalized. Heroin, cocaine, ecstasy, cannabis, it should all be legalized. We already have drugs in our system. We have alcohol, we have tobacco, nicotine, which incidentally, just sidetracking for a moment, probably responsible for a very large number of deaths. And how do we deal with those? We deal with them by making a minimum age to purchase them. So it might be 18 for alcohol. This could be 21 for drugs. We deal with them by sometimes, on other related drugs, having prescription-based. Now the advantage of that is, what we're doing is we are taking the manufacturing aspect away from the drugs gangsters, and we are putting them with those who we can trust to act responsibly. And so if, for example, you were looking at the constituents of heroin, nobody's recommending anybody takes it, but we live in a free world where people have free choice. And those people who elect to have that free choice will know that what they are taking has not been, and not had rather, impurities added to them by gangsters who are just motivated by profit. There are a number of competing issues, a number of competing thoughts that go into having a system like this. And I think what helps us to understand how it could succeed are the example of two other countries. And the two other countries that I've looked at are Holland and Portugal. In the Dutch example, because one of the concerns of those who are against this argument is that, well, if you legalise, there'll be so much more drug taking going on. In the Dutch example, where, as we know, it's not that it's legalised, it's that the police don't enforce. In other words, there's a slight difference, decriminalisation as opposed to making legal, but the effect is the same. In the Dutch example, the rates of drug taking are amongst, and I think are in fact the lowest in Europe before the example I'm about to give. And that's used as a counter to this argument, legalise it and everybody will be taking it. Oh no, I'm not saying you don't educate people about the dangers of drug taking, like we don't educate people, or we do rather, on the dangers of smoking or the dangers of drinking alcohol. Let there be free choice, but for my part, let my children, let all of you be able to walk around the street not thinking that you're going to be a statistic in this 80 to 90% acquisitive crime wave when people are trying to get money for drugs. Let people be educated. In the Portuguese example, in 1999, believe it or not, 1% of the Portuguese population were determined to be addicted to heroin. In 2001, in Portugal, all drugs were legalised. Before 2001, Portugal had one of the highest rates in the world of drug taking. And what they found was, after the legislation came through, which changed the position in Portugal, there was a slight increase at first, but after that, when mechanisms kicked in, the drug taking in Portugal reduced dramatically. And from being the highest in Europe, my understanding is it's now even lower than it is in Holland. So these are statistics that we need to think about, because if we're going to go down this route, it's very easy to get sucked in by arguments that if you do it, it's going to be doom and gloom. The Portuguese example, the Dutch example, are those where the opposite has been the case. And in the Portuguese example, and this is what I would say would need to happen here as well, before 1999, it was the Department of Criminal Justice that dealt with issues of drug taking. Since 2001, it's gone to the Health Department. In other words, the whole movement of thought about the way we deal with drugs has moved to criminalising it, to helping people. And Portugal now, as I understand it, has one of the highest uptakes of those who've gone to health education to help them deal with the issues that just a short generation ago was decimating that society. So, my contention then today on this what if is, what if we took this step? What if there was genuine discussion, not politically driven by, if I may respectfully say so, those in the Daily Mail who don't, or maybe should know better, but choose not to? What if there was true discussion whereby one of the biggest blights of our society, which has caused the ruination of many families and many societies, and as I've mentioned in that Cumbria small village, I think it had 60,000 people living in there, for 16 to die in the space of 2 months is quite extraordinary. And it's all because there is no, in my view, open discussion about these issues where we can take the stigma away, work with people who have these drugs issues, and create a system where we are not looking to punish and criminalise, but to educate and help. So that's my, hopefully, creative solution to what I consider to be one of the biggest problems. Thank you.